What's up, everyone? Welcome to another Team Kitchen Fable video. I'm Jacob. I'm joined by my teammate Steven, and we have Helio today. We're going to be talking about equipment usage in Flesh and Blood. We have the skirmish season coming up, and I think one of the most important aspects of Blitz and Classic Constructed is using your equipment and getting all of the value out of it that you can and not wasting it. If you are looking forward to it, go ahead and keep watching. But in the meantime, if you want to support us, leave a like, a comment, and a subscribe, and we would really appreciate it. So yeah, the first piece of blocking with equipment is that you should not block psychological damage. And when we're talking about psychological damage, we mean big cards like this. So if you have an Endless Maw coming at you for 9 damage, and you have 2-3 blocks in hand, and you can block 6, and you have 2 equipment pieces that can add 3, you can just cleanly block the 9 damage. And you may have the urge to block the 9 damage and add the equipment block in there, just because these teeth are very scary and bloody and you don't want to get hit by them, or it could be any other big number of attack. But I'm here to tell you that you should not do that. And that's the number one mistake that I see people making in Blitz, in Classic Constructed, is blocking raw damage with equipment. And for the rest of the video, we're going to number off a bunch of different things that you should use equipment on, and a bunch of ways to think about your equipment blocking. But I just want to start this out with the number one thing that I'm pretty sure everyone has done when they started the game, is just throw an equipment piece when it's convenient in front of a big number. And that definitely can lose you the game in a lot of situations. But I'm going to hand it over to Steven to talk about the first thing that you should be using equipment blocks for.
First thing is on hits. Look what the piece that we have here, Snatch. Just the quintessential on hit. If Snatch hits, draw a card. If you have equipment, you can have a nice clean block of 3 and 1 with your Iron Rod equipment if you so have it, and that would net you the 4 block. Obviously, if you have defense reactions or you have other pieces, other ways to block damage in your kit, you can make it much cleaner. But we're talking about equipment here and using it effectively, and most of our cards in Flesh and Blood do block for 3. There's also 2 block equipment that you can mix in with your 2 block cards, and it's also recognizing if the Snatch is valuable to block. For example, it's at the end of a chain and the opponent is threatening to use the Snatch to Arsenal card to have a 5-card hand to continue in the next turn, or they have ways to give it go again, like Snapdragon Scalers, or it already has go again with Quicken Token or an embodiment of Lightning or something along those lines. So recognizing and being able to block Snatch cleanly with equipment while you're losing the least amount of value from your hand is the best way to use it. Another good on-hit effect to block effectively is going to be Command and Conquer. Command and Conquer, obviously, if you're trading any amount of cards with Command and Conquer, the opponent is winning. If you are able to use the minimal amount versus what they're throwing at you is what you want to use that value of in this situation. For Command and Conquer, there's a few uses. You can do a 3-block and a 2-block equipment and a 1-block equipment. You can use a 2-block card and 2-block equipment. And there's actually also a very new equipment piece that we're going to talk about later that will help you against Command and Conquer as well. But thinking about this card coming in as it is a generic card, and it is going to come at you a good amount of the time, is actually very powerful because it's always asking your opponent for something. If you have an arsenal, if you have an arsenal, you have to give the opponent some cards and maybe some equipment if you want to keep the most amount of value for yourself. And if you don't, you're not only going to take 6 damage, but you're also going to lose a card. So that's a really interesting trade that you got to think about when you're going through the game plan.
And I just wanted to point out the raw numbers of this on-hit effect. When you use your equipment on this, you're not just saving yourself 4 life. If we assume that an aggressive deck, which is using a card like Snatch, will draw a card, and that card itself will be worth another 3 or 4 points of life, your equipment is actually pulling a lot of weight, because you have a 3-block and like a 1-block from equipment could actually be stopping 3 more damage, making that worth like 7. So you could either use your 2-block on your equipment to block an Endless Maw, and the only thing you got out of that was 2 life, or you could use like 2-block equipments to block 7 damage because it's 4 from Snatch and 3 more potential damage, or maybe
Mhm.
it's like a D react that they put in Arsenal, which is stopping 3 health from you doing, or 3 damage from you doing. But yeah, that's just like it's so much more value to block on hit effects than it is to block just raw damage.
Very true.
Yeah.
Very true. And then we're moving on to what Jacob's going to talk about, which is going to be life thresholds as well.
Yeah, so my favorite life threshold in the game is the reckless swing threshold. So
Group player.
the times when it's okay to block raw damage are actually when you're not trying to go below a life threshold. So, and it's a good example for Brute because Brute really doesn't have that many on hit effects. Like Swing Big is a pseudo on hit effect. A lot of times the Quicken token is wasted, and they can run Command and Conquer sometimes. But a very important aspect to playing against Rhinar and Levy as well, because she can run Reckless Swing, is to not go below 3 life. Because as soon as you have 2 or 1 life, you can die. You can rip the Rhinar's entire hand for the rest of the game. But as soon as they draw their Reckless Swing, they will just kill you against your will, unless you have like, for some reason, you're running Quell or Oasis Respite or something. Those are very few ways to block Reckless Swing.
Sure.
But there's a number of other evasive damage in the game. Reckless Swing is just an obvious one. Definitely, it is okay to use your equipment to not go below a certain life threshold against Rhinar. So don't go below 3. If you for some reason know your opponent has 2 Reckless Swings in the deck, it could be worth not going below 5 so you don't die to double Reckless. But that kind of requires a lot more resources. May not be worth it. But the next one is against Warriors. They have Steel Blade Shunt. If you attack with your weapon, it just deals 1 unblockable damage to you. So I would not go below 2 life against Warriors if you can help it. And using your equipment is totally valid to do that.
Mhm.
The next one is Rosetta Thorn. Arcane damage is evasive by default because you have to use Arcane Barrier on it. But a lot of the times, Rosetta Thorn is extra evasive because most classes in the game don't really want to be bringing Arcane Barrier 2 against the Rune Blades. And Rosetta Thorn does 8 instants of 2 Arcane, so you cannot block both of them with a single Arcane Barrier. So if you are against a Rune Blade and they're running Rosetta Thorn, I would suggest staying above 3 life, maybe even more, because as soon as you hit 2 life, you're going to have to dedicate a whole card to block the Rosetta Thorn Arcane damage.
Mhm.
And that's dedicating a whole card just to block 1 damage, which is in itself losing value. So you would rather have blocked with equipment earlier in the game so that you could take the 2 Arcane to the face and block the physical some other way.
Yep. And if the opponent Runeblade is not running Rosetta Thorn, then you'll be okay.
Yeah.
I think you'll be okay.
Yeah. And even then, if it's just like Arcane damage itself is really just evasive because you have to dedicate cards to it. And if it's just one rune chant coming at you and you're on 1 life, you have to pitch a card to block it, like no matter what, unless you have a tuning counter up, of course. So definitely don't go too low against the Rune Blades, and using equipment to prevent that from happening is totally valid.
Very true. Very true.
The last evasive damage is Dominate. I mean, that's very clearly evasive. If they're coming in with 8 Dominate and you're on 5 life with no equipment, a 3 block will still present you lethal. But if you did have equipment and you used it on the turn before, then a 3 block will keep you alive. But then again, you could have just used the equipment on that turn to keep yourself alive as well. But you can always use equipment to prevent from going into too low against evasive heroes like this. Next one we want to talk about is getting extra use out of your equipment, and Steven is going to tell us about that.
Yep, I think it's a good segue here about using just your equipment in general to understand the ebb and flow of the game and when you will be getting threatened with lethal range. So using your equipment in a way to essentially buy yourself an extra turn or an extra threshold of life. One of the good examples is in Battleworn equipment, because you need to block with it twice to get the full 2 and 1 block value here. And a thing that can happen if you're not careful is that the opponent will present to you a long chain link, and then you go and block with your Grasp of the Arcanite, and then they don't close the chain link. Therefore, your equipment is stuck in that chain link, blocking that 2 damage that it already did, and you are unable to get that 1 value. And if you happen to die with an equipment with technically here one counter on it, one negative one counter on it, you've kind of lost value throughout the game, and it's just strictly a misplay if you don't use it to its full potential in that way. Additionally, there's also you want to be using it still to block on-hit effects if able, but it's still important to understand what thresholds of life and with cards you can use to block with. So 2 and 2 feels really nice to block the snatch, as we mentioned earlier, and if it's at 1 block, you can do 3 and 1 to block a snatch. It gets a little bit turned on its head here with the other equipment. We also have temper equipment, specifically here, the Courage of Bladehold, because you also, to make sure you get the proper value off of this, you got to block with it a little earlier, maybe not an on-hit effect with the Courage of Bladehold, and mostly use it, make sure you're blocking with it before you use the action, because the action on temper equipment usually breaks the equipment as well. And if you find yourself in a great situation in which breaking your Courage of Bladehold is going to net you a lot of damage to the opponent, I think you should still go for it, but just be careful and know that you have lost 2 worth of life value throughout the game in that scenario if you do that. So that means you probably missed a very good chance to just use your equipment to block at some point, even if it was something weird like blocking a 2 on a 3 attack card or a 2 on a 4 attack card that did nothing. But it's important that you get this life value before you break the equipment. Yes, perfect. Yeah, that was mostly what I wanted to say about those. And Jacob, What are we talking about? Being lower life. How good that feels.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to talk about, it's not actually, this is the second to last topic, but it wraps around to the first topic, which is psychological damage. So not only is it bad to block psychological damage with equipment, in a lot of cases, it's actually good to just let the raw damage hit. A huge example is Scar for a Scar. A lot of times it's good for you to be lower than your opponent. So if your opponent comes in with like a raw 4 damage attack on a turn, and you have the option of either like taking the 4 damage and going lower than them, or for some reason you give it 2 block equipment pieces and stay higher on life than them, then after that they Scar for a Scar and they just have free go again. So Scar for a Scar, and then also Skullcap is another huge one. Both of these scenarios are the game mechanics rewarding you for being lower than your opponent. So if you can kind of play a little bit of a game of chicken and take more damage than your opponent, saving your equipment for those valuable on-hit effects, those valuable life thresholds, and different lethal ranges to stay out of, you actually gain a lot of value, because all of a sudden your opponent, who has all these Scar for Scars in their deck, kind of depending on being lower than you, if you're lower than them, you're just making it more awkward for them to play those. And we can probably have like a whole 30-minute discussion on Skullcap, because this has historically been like a huge mini game, just making sure that you can get value out of your Skullcap, trying to prevent your opponent from getting value out of your Skullcap. And there's a huge skill threshold just in using Skullcap. But if you can get to the end of the game, you go to 1 life, and your opponent has not used one of their Skullcap blocks, you completely just erased 2 life from their threshold, or at least 1 life from them. Because they just can't use the Skullcap anymore because you're on 1 and they can't possibly be lower than you without dying. So I just wanted to reinforce the idea of not worrying too much about raw damage. Like, just take the raw damage early in the game. You can have your equipment later. It's always going to be there. There's very few effects in the game that will just destroy your equipment without you using it. So just save the equipment. Just use it later on in the game. And you're going to be rewarded for that in multiple ways. And then with the Skullcap is the last thing we want to talk about, which Steven is going to tell us about Skullcap versus the brand new helmet that we got in Uprising.
Yep, and it's going to be the Crown of Providence. As Jacob mentioned, the Skullcap minigame in a long day of events can actually be quite a taxing piece of equipment to bring into the table, as you have to think about not only your life threshold, but the opponent's life threshold. When am I planning to be lower than my opponent? Should I use it here for the on-hit value? Should I not use it here because it might be more beneficial to use it later? But then will I lose my value because I'm going to be lower than my opponent? That's a whole thing. That's a lot of things to keep track of during a game of Flesh and Blood. There's already so many minute details here about your opponent's hero power, what they could have in the deck, etc., etc. So Crown of Providence kind of makes it a little bit of. You still have to think about a few things here because Crown of Providence always blocks 2, but it'll break right afterwards. It has the very nice feature is that it will mostly cleanly block a Command and Conquer. As when you block with it, the Command and Conquer, you will just put the Arsenal card at the bottom of your deck and draw it, and you will keep your 5-card hand while only taking 4 damage. And in a game when it comes to inches like that is quite a good trade for you. There's the easiest way to explain it. It's going to be a good trade for you if you block with Crown of Providence and they did not get one of your cards that you're going to use offensively towards them. Yeah, and way less taxing as well. Just knowing when to use your cards. If you've played your deck, you know what a bad hand looks like. And if Crown of Providence can fix that bad hand and make it into a winning hand, you're going to feel very, very good. That's just it. That's what Crown of Providence does on top of giving you 2 block worth of value. Again, Hope Merchant's Hood was really good for fixing hands. And I love that card. So Crown of Providence does that and give you some block value. So excellent there.
Yeah, I definitely love Crown of Providence. I think it's a great decision that they added it to the game. But also, I don't think it's a pure power creep. Like, I think Skullcap still has a lot of value. Super defensive decks can still use Skullcap. I mean, you're talking about blocking 2 on-hit effects versus 1. You're talking about getting 1 extra life over the course of the game. Just from the devil's advocate point of view, like, Skullcap still has a lot going for it. If you're specifically a new player and you don't have Crown of Providence and you don't want to buy it, but you bought like Skullcap maybe a month ago before you saw the Uprising spoiled Crown of Providence, I really don't think you should feel bad about just using Skullcap instead of Crown. It's still very valuable. It's a high Skullcap card. Definitely don't worry about it. But yeah, I think Skullcap and Crown of Providence is definitely going to be a debate every single deck you build. I think unless you have like Mask of Momentum or something, like unless you're Oldham and you have Crown of Seeds, all the other decks, there's definitely valid points on both sides of those. But yeah, that's what we wanted to talk about with using your equipment throughout the course of the game. It's super important for Blitz. With Blitz, you have half as much life as you do in Classic Constructed. So if you end your turn and you didn't get 1 point of life out of like your Grasp of the Arcanite, that's actually 5% of your life total. It's only 2.5% in Classic Constructed, so the margin of error is a little bit nicer for CC. But that's why we wanted to release this video for Skirmish season. We hope you guys found value out of this. Once again, I think using equipment is like one of the first steps up that you can really start focusing on in your Blitz games, and getting valid use out of them, blocking those on hits, and all of that good stuff is going to really step up your game. And I think it's going to put you in a good spot for Skirmish season. But if you liked the video, definitely hit the like button and leave a comment if there's other topics that you want to hear about. Maybe there's other aspects of the game that you want to learn how to get better at. Definitely let us know. We're always trying to increase the skill level of all of our audience and all the people that are playing this game. And we really appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you next time.
Peace.